5.5 million people live in a country that occupies the northern third of Great Britain. With a landscape shaped by glaciers that retreated 12,000 years ago, leaving behind glens, lochs, and mountains that define the scenery tourists expect and the weather patterns that locals endure. Scotland is not a nation-state, but a country within the United Kingdom. Each with devolved powers since 1999, allowing the Scottish Parliament to control education, health and law, while defence and foreign policy remain in Westminster's hands, creating constitutional arrangements that satisfy neither unionists who want full integration nor nationalists who want independence. This is the land of whiskey, distilled in over 130 distilleries, kilts worn at weddings and football matches, bagpipes played at festivals and funerals, Chi and Gaelic spoken by fewer than 60,000 people, mostly in the Western Isles, where the language survived clearances and Anglicisation that destroyed it elsewhere. The history is clan warfare, religious conflict, union with England in 1707, Industrial Revolution, making Glasgow the Empire's second city. Then deindustrialization, leaving communities struggling with unemployment and drugs. Yet Scotland is also spectacular landscapes, vibrant cities, warm people, and culture that remains distinctly Scottish despite 3 centuries of political union with England. Subscribe to Passport Unfolded and discover Scotland beyond tartan and shortbread. The capital contains 500,000 people in a city built on volcanic plugs and ridges. With the castle sitting on an extinct volcano and the Royal Mile descending the ridge to Holyrood Palace at the base. The Old Town is medieval stone buildings, rising 7 stories. It's with narrow closes and winds connecting the high street to the streets below in a vertical city that grew upward when defensive walls prevented outward expansion. The new town is Georgian planning and neoclassical architecture laid out in the 18th century when Edinburgh was the Athens of the North, producing David Hume, Adam Smith, and the Scottish Enlightenment that shaped modern philosophy and economics. The Edinburgh Festival in August transforms the city into the world's largest arts festival. With the Fringe offering thousands of performances and the streets becoming stages for every genre, from comedy to circus. Edinburgh is beautiful, cultured, and expensive, with the tourism industry dominating the Old Town and the locals increasingly priced out of the centre. The city contains over 600,000 people in the urban area. is making it Scotland's largest city and the former industrial powerhouse, where shipbuilding on the Clyde made it the empire's workshop. The Victorian architecture reflects the wealth generated by heavy industry, with buildings by Charles Rennie Mackintosh demonstrating the Glasgow style that influenced European Art Nouveau. The city declined after World War II, when shipbuilding collapsed and the population fell by a third. Between 1960 and 1990, as people moved to new towns or emigrated seeking work. The city reinvented itself through culture and services, with the Burrell Collection, the Riverside Museum, and the SSE Hydro making Glasgow a cultural destination, rather than purely an industrial ruin. The city is grittier than Edinburgh, with the humour being sharper and the accent being impenetrable to outsiders, but the warmth being genuine once you penetrate the exterior. Glasgow represents Scotland's working-class identity, shaped by industry, immigration, and resilience. The Highland capital sits at the head of the Moray Firth, where the River Ness flows from Loch Ness into the sea. With the city serving as the commercial and administrative centre for the Highlands, despite having a population of only 70,000. The city is the departure point for tours to Loch Ness, the Isle of Skye, and the CAIRNGORMS. With the tourism industry being the main employer alongside public sector services. The city was historically a fortress controlling the Northern Highlands, with Inverness Castle sitting on a hill above the river. Though the current building is Victorian and houses the courts, rather than being a historic structure open to visitors. The city is pleasant without being remarkable, with the riverside walks and the Victorian market being worth a few hours. But the real attractions being the landscapes accessible from the city rather than the city itself. Inverness represents the modern Highlands, where Gaelic culture has largely disappeared and the economy depends on tourism and public employment rather than traditional livelihoods. The island off the west coast is the largest of the Inner Hebrides, connected to the mainland by bridge since 1995, in infrastructure that ended the ferry monopoly and opened the island to mass tourism that has transformed the economy while creating pressures on the roads and the environment. And the Queen Mountains dominate the southern part of the island, with jagged peaks of gabbro and basalt rising over 900 meters and providing some of Britain's most challenging climbing and scrambling. The Old Man of Storr is a pinnacle of rock that rises 48 meters from the plateau. with the hike to the base being accessible to anyone with reasonable fitness and the views across the island justifying the crowds that arrive during summer. The fairy pools are crystal clear streams cascading over rocks into pools that are photographed constantly despite being too cold for swimming except by the brave or the foolish. Skye is spectacular but crowded, with the infrastructure struggling to handle visitor numbers that overwhelm the narrow roads. The Loch in the Great Glen is the largest body of freshwater in Britain by volume, thus containing more water than all the lakes in England and Wales combined, despite not being the largest by surface area. The Loch is famous for the Loch Ness monster, or Nessie, a creature allegedly inhabiting the depths and providing the basis for a tourism industry that sells monster-themed souvenirs. While serious people acknowledge the monster is a myth supported by misidentifications and hoaxes. The Loch is genuinely beautiful when viewed from the ruins of ORKNEY Castle on the western shore. As with the water stretching 23 miles to the northeast and the mountains rising on both sides. The Loch is deep enough at over 200 meters that it never freezes, and the water is dark, with peat making underwater visibility poor, creating conditions that allowed the monster myth to persist despite the absence of evidence. Loch Ness represents Scottish tourism at its most commercial, with the landscape being genuine, but the monster being marketing. The Loch is the largest by surface area in Great Britain, stretching 24 miles from north to south and containing over 30 islands, with the southern end being accessible from Glasgow, making it popular for day trips and water sports. The Loch is within the Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park, established in 2002. To protect the landscape and manage the recreation pressure that threatens the environment. The West Highland Way, long-distance footpath, follows the eastern shore for 25 miles. With the trail being one of Scotland's most popular multi-day hikes, despite the midges that make summer hiking unpleasant for those not prepared with repellent and head nets. The song "The Bonnie Banks o' Loch Lomond" is known globally, despite most singers not understanding that the Low Road refers to the Celtic belief that the souls of the dead travel underground to return to their homeland. And Loch Lomond is an accessible beauty, with the southern end being crowded while the northern reaches remain quieter. The mountain is Britain's highest peak at 1,345 meters, with the summit being above the cloud layer more often than not, and the weather being severe enough that people die on the mountain almost every year from falls, exposure, or avalanches. The tourist path or pony track from Glen Nevis is the most popular route, but taking 4 to 6 hours to ascend and being technically straightforward in summer, but requiring navigation skills in winter when snow and ice make the upper sections treacherous. The mountain is a remnant of a volcano that collapsed inward 350 million years ago. With the ruins of the summit observatory demonstrating Victorian scientific ambition before the station was abandoned in 1904 when funding ran out. The mountain attracts over 100,000 ascents annually, with many climbers being unprepared for the conditions and requiring rescue by the LOCH Mountain Rescue Team. Ben Nevis represents Scottish mountains, beautiful but dangerous, accessible but demanding respect. The Glen in the Highlands is famous for the 1692 massacre, when government soldiers staying with the MacDonald clan murdered 38 people in an act that violated Highland hospitality codes and created a grievance that persists in folk memory 3 centuries later. The Glen is spectacular, regardless of its history, with the 3 peaks of the Three Sisters rising on the south side and the A82 road threading through the valley floor, past waterfalls and viewpoints. The Glen is popular with climbers and scramblers who use it as a base for routes on Boachaile Itiv Moor and the Ionac Igach Ridge. With the latter being one of Britain's finest scrambles, but also one of its most dangerous, with multiple fatalities occurring annually. The Glen is dramatic in any weather, with the mist creating atmosphere when it closes in, and the rare clear days providing views that extend to Ben Nevis and beyond. East Glencoe represents Highland history and landscape compressed into a single valley where beauty and tragedy coexist. The city sits at the narrowest point of the central belt, where the River Forth could be bridged, making it strategically significant in conflicts between Scotland and England, with the castle changing hands multiple times during the Wars of Independence. The population is modest at 36,000, but the historical importance being disproportionate to the size, with the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 and the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, being victories that preserved Scottish independence despite England's larger population and resources. The Wallace Monument on Abbey Craig commemorates William Wallace, with the tower rising 67 meters and offering views across the battlefield, where Wallace defeated a larger English army by controlling the bridge and attacking while the enemy was divided. The city is pleasant with the castle, the old town, and the university, creating a compact urban area that is livable and attractive without the tourist crowds overwhelming Edinburgh. Stirling represents Scottish independence struggles, with the monuments celebrating resistance rather than accepting subordination. The castle sits on a volcanic crag, 100 meters above the surrounding plain, with the position providing defensive advantages that made it one of Scotland's most important fortresses, controlling the route between the lowlands and the highlands. The current buildings are mostly Renaissance palaces, constructed by James IV and James V in the early 16th century, each with the Great Hall and the Royal Palace demonstrating Scottish royal architecture before the Union of Crowns in 1603 moved the court to London. The castle was a military barracks until 1964, when the army withdrew and it became a tourist attraction. With the buildings being restored to approximate their 16th century appearance rather than preserving the Victorian barrack modifications. The castle provides views across the surrounding landscape to Wallace Monument, the Ochil Hills, and the site of Bannockburn, with the geography explaining why control of Stirling meant control of central Scotland. The castle represents the Scottish monarchy, before Union and before the royal court abandoned Edinburgh for London. The castle sits on a tidal island where 3 lochs meet in the Western Highlands, with the location being one of the most photographed in Scotland, appearing on shortbread tins, whiskey bottles, and tourism posters globally. The current structure is a 20th century reconstruction, with the original castle being destroyed by government ships in 1719 after the Jacobite Rising failed, and the castle lay in ruins until John McCrae Gilstrap purchased it in 1911 and spent 20 years rebuilding it. The castle is beautiful in a manufactured way, with the reconstruction being based on limited evidence and considerable imagination. At creating a castle that looks how people expect Scottish castles to look, rather than how they actually were. The interior is open to visitors, with rooms displaying clan artifacts, weapons, and furniture that create atmosphere even if the historical authenticity is questionable. Eilean Donan represents Scottish heritage as performance, with the reality being less important than the image that satisfies tourist expectations. The national park covers 4,500 square kilometers in the Eastern Highlands, protecting the largest area of Arctic mountain landscape in Britain, with plateaus above 1,000 meters supporting plants and animals found nowhere else in the UK. The park contains 5 of Britain's 6 highest mountains, and with the Cairngorm Plateau being a subarctic environment, where winter conditions can persist into June, and where navigation requires skills and equipment similar to alpine mountaineering. The park supports rare species, including the Scottish wildcat, capercaillie, and golden eagle. Though populations are declining due to habitat loss, disturbance, and in the wildcat's case, hybridization with domestic cats. The park balances conservation with recreation, there with the ski resort at Cairngorm. Being controversial for environmental impact while providing economic activity in communities that have few alternatives. The Cairngorms represent Scottish wilderness, though even here, human impact is visible in the grouse moors, the forestry plantations, and the paths eroded by walkers. The town sits at the head of Loch Linnhe, below Ben Nevis, serving as the outdoor capital of the UK, with climbing, hiking, mountain biking, and skiing being the economic drivers in a location where traditional industries have declined or disappeared. The town itself is architecturally undistinguished, with the main street being functional rather than attractive, and the best views being from outside, looking at the mountains, rather than from inside, looking at the buildings. The West Highland Way terminates in Fort William, after 96 miles from Milngavie near Glasgow. With the trail being one of Britain's most popular long-distance paths, despite the midges and the often boggy conditions. The town is base rather than destination, with visitors staying here to climb Ben Nevis, to ride the Nevis Range mountain bike trails, or to take the JACOBITE steam train to MULL. Fort William represents the outdoor recreation economy that has replaced traditional employment in Highland towns where fishing and industry have collapsed. The town on the Fife coast is famous for golf, with the Old Course being the oldest golf course in the world, where the sport was codified into the rules that govern the game globally. The Royal and Ancient Golf Club controls the rules of golf in every country except the United States. With the clubhouse overlooking the 18th green, being the sport's spiritual home. The town is also home to Scotland's oldest university, founded in 1413 and educating Prince William and Kate Middleton, among other notable alumni. with the student population giving the town energy during term time. The ruins of the cathedral demonstrate the town's ecclesiastical importance before the Reformation destroyed much of Scotland's Catholic heritage, with the cathedral having been the largest church in Scotland before it was abandoned and used as a quarry. St Andrews is prosperous and pleasant, with the golf tourism and the university creating an economy that insulates it from the struggles affecting other Scottish towns. The island off the west coast is the fourth largest of the Scottish Islands, with a landscape of mountains, forests, beaches, and the colourful harbour town of Tobermory that appears on the children's television programme Balamory, making it recognisable to British families. The island is accessed by ferry from OBAN, with the crossing taking 45 minutes, and the island being large enough that exploring properly requires several days and a vehicle. The island supports otter, sea eagle, and golden eagle populations that attract wildlife enthusiasts, with boat tours from Tobermory and Fionfort offering whale and dolphin watching when conditions allow. The island is quieter than Skye, despite being accessible and beautiful, with the roads being single-track with passing places requiring patience and courtesy from drivers unaccustomed to the system. Mull represents the Hebridean Islands at their most accessible, offering highland scenery and wildlife without the remoteness that makes the Outer Hebrides challenging for casual visitors. The island is the southern part of Lewis and Harris, which is the largest island in the Outer Hebrides, despite the name suggesting two separate islands. The island is famous for Harris tweed, hand-woven cloth made from pure virgin wool, dyed and spun in the Outer Hebrides and woven by islanders in their homes using treadle looms, with the product being protected by an Act of Parliament. The West Coast beaches are spectacular, with white sand and turquoise water that would not look out of place in the Caribbean, except for the temperature and the lack of palm trees. The East Coast is dramatically different, and with rocky inlets and mountains rising directly from the sea, creating scenery that is beautiful but harsh. The population is small and declining, with young people leaving for education and employment on the mainland and not returning despite the beauty and the culture. Harris represents the Outer Hebrides, beautiful but marginal, where traditional ways of life struggle against economic realities. The island is the northern part of Lewis and Harris, with the landscape being flatter and more dominated by peat bogs than the mountainous terrain of Harris to the south. The island is the centre of Gaelic culture in Scotland, with the language being spoken as a community language rather than as a heritage curiosity maintained by enthusiasts. The island is also the heartland of Scottish Presbyterianism, as with the Free Church being dominant and Sunday observance being strict in communities where swings in playgrounds are chained on the Sabbath and ferries do not operate. The Callanish stones are a Neolithic monument predating Stonehenge, with the stones being arranged in a cross shape and the purpose being unknown despite centuries of speculation. Lewis represents Scotland's cultural margins, where Gaelic and Presbyterian traditions persist in forms that have disappeared elsewhere, and creating communities that are distinct from the Scottish mainstream. The archipelago off the north coast of Scotland contains 70 islands, of which 20 are inhabited. With the landscape being low-lying and treeless due to the wind that blows constantly from the North Sea. The islands have more in common culturally with Scandinavia than with Scotland, having been under Norwegian control until 1472, when they were pledged to Scotland as part of a royal dowry. The islands contain Neolithic monuments, including Skara Brae, the Ring of Brodgar, and the standing stones of Stennis that demonstrate sophisticated prehistoric societies living here 5,000 years ago. The islands are rich in archaeological sites, with new discoveries being made regularly as coastal erosion exposes structures buried for millennia. The population is stable by Scottish Island standards, with the economy based on farming, fishing, renewable energy, and tourism. Orkney represents Scotland's Norse heritage, with place names and cultural references connecting the islands to Scandinavia more than to the Highlands. The archipelago sits 100 miles north of the Scottish mainland and closer to Norway than to Edinburgh, with the location creating a culture that is distinct from mainland Scotland. And the climate being harsh, with winter storms and summer days extending to 18 hours of daylight. The islands were Norse until 1469, when they were pledged to Scotland along with Orkney, with the Norse influence persisting in language, place names, and the Uphelly Our Fire festival in January that celebrates Viking heritage with torch-lit processions and the burning of a replica longship. The island's economy was transformed by oil in the 1970s, when the Sullom Voe terminal was built to process North Sea crude. And with the revenue creating prosperity unusual in Scottish islands and funding infrastructure that other islands cannot afford. The islands are remote enough that visiting requires commitment, with flights from Aberdeen or Inverness being the practical option. Though ferries operate for those with time and strong stomachs for overnight crossings in the North Sea. Shetland represents Scotland's extreme north, beautiful, remote, and culturally distinct. The town on the west coast serves as the ferry terminal for the Inner and Outer Hebrides, with services to Mull, Cole, Tiree, Barra and South Uist departing from the harbour that dominates the town's economy. The town is small with 8,000 residents, but the strategic position makes it significant beyond its size as the main gateway to the islands and the commercial centre for the surrounding region. McCaig's Tower on the hill above the town is a 19th century folly built to provide employment during a recession, with the structure being modelled on the Colosseum in Rome and remaining incomplete when the patron died. The town has whiskey distilleries, seafood restaurants, and views across the Firth of Lorne to the islands, making it pleasant for an overnight stay before or after island travel. Oban is functional rather than beautiful, and with the town succeeding at its role as transit hub without pretending to be a destination in itself. Dundee, the city on the Tay estuary, was historically a jute manufacturing centre. With the industry declining in the 20th century, when synthetic fibres and cheaper labour elsewhere made Dundee uncompetitive. The city has reinvented itself through higher education and culture. And with 2 universities and the V&A Museum, designed by Kengo Kuma, opening in 2018 as the centerpiece of waterfront regeneration. The city is associated with journalism and publishing, with D.C. Thomson producing the Beano, the Dandy, and the Courier from headquarters in the city centre. The city has rough edges, with poverty and drug problems persisting in the peripheral estates despite the city centre improvements. The RRS Discovery, the ship that carried Scott's Antarctic expedition, Yachts is berthed in the harbour as a museum ship displaying the vessel and explaining the expedition. Dundee represents Scottish post-industrial cities, managing decline while seeking new economic foundations in education and culture. The city on the northeast coast is Scotland's 3rd largest, with a population of 200,000 and an economy historically based on fishing and granite quarrying before oil transformed it into the energy capital of Europe. The discovery of North Sea oil in the 1970s brought wealth to Aberdeen, with the offshore industry supporting high-paying jobs and the city developing infrastructure and services that made it prosperous by Scottish standards. The downturn in oil prices from 2014 onward reminded the city of its dependence on a single industry, with job losses and reduced investment creating economic challenges. The city is built from granite quarried locally, with the buildings being grey and solid, thus creating architecture that is durable, but not beautiful. Aberdeen is hard-working and affluent, with the work ethic being shaped by the North Sea industry, where mistakes can be fatal and the stakes are measured in millions of pounds. The town sits between Edinburgh and Glasgow, historically significant for the Falkirk Wheel and the nearby Antonine Wall that marked the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. The town itself is unremarkable, and with the canal basin and the surrounding area being redeveloped with the Falkirk Wheel as the centerpiece, attracting tourists. The town was the site of 2 battles during the Wars of Scottish Independence, with William Wallace being defeated here in 1298 by English forces using tactics that nullified the Scottish spear formations. The town is functional rather than attractive, serving as a regional center for retail and services without having the historical or architectural significance that makes other Scottish towns interesting to tourists. Falkirk represents central Scotland's industrial belt, where history and modern infrastructure coexist in towns that are lived in rather than visited. The sculptures near Falkirk are 30-meter-high horse heads made from steel. As designed by Andy Scott and completed in 2013 as monuments to the horse-powered heritage of Scotland. The Kelpies are named after the mythological water horses from Scottish folklore that could shapeshift and were believed to haunt lochs and rivers. Though the sculptures reference working horses that pulled barges and ploughs rather than the malevolent spirits. The sculptures are impressive for their scale and engineering. And with the steel structure being designed to withstand wind loads and the weight being supported on foundations that extend deep into the ground. The Kelpies have become a tourist attraction, despite being a modern creation without historical significance, demonstrating that contemporary art can create destinations when executed at sufficient scale and with adequate publicity. The sculptures represent Scotland's ability to create new heritage rather than only preserving old monuments. It's a royal mile. The street connects Edinburgh Castle to Holyrood Palace, descending the ridge that forms the spine of the old town through a series of name changes that collectively form the Royal Mile. The street is lined with closes and wynds that were the entrances to the tenement buildings where Edinburgh's population lived in vertical density, with the wealthy on the lower floors and the poor in the garrets at the top. The street is tourist-focused now, with tartan shops, whiskey sellers and bagpipe players, creating an atmosphere that is commercially Scottish rather than authentically local. St. Giles Cathedral dominates the High Street section, with the church being the mother church of Presbyterianism and the site where the National Covenant was signed in 1638, opposing Charles I's attempt to impose Anglican practices on Scotland. The Royal Mile represents Edinburgh's tourist face, beautiful but commercialized, and with the history being genuine even if the tartans are made in China. The hill is an extinct volcano rising 251 meters in Holyrood Park at the east end of Edinburgh, with the summit providing views across the city to the Forth and to the Highlands beyond. The hill is accessible by several routes, ranging from easy paths to scrambly ascents requiring hands-on rock, and with the most popular route from Holyrood being crowded on summer evenings and weekends. The name possibly derives from legends connecting the hill to King Arthur, though the etymology is uncertain and the connection to Arthurian mythology being speculative. The hill is a geology classroom, with the volcanic features including columnar basalt and the evidence of glacial erosion being visible to anyone willing to examine the rocks, rather than only photographing the views. Arthur's Seat represents Edinburgh's natural heritage, providing wilderness in the center of the capital and demonstrating the volcanic origins of the city's topography. The battlefield near Inverness is where the Jacobite Rising of 1745 ended in defeat on April 16, 1746. With Bonnie Prince Charlie's Highland army being destroyed by government forces in a battle lasting less than an hour. The battle was not Scotland versus England, but rather a civil war between Jacobites supporting the exiled Stuart dynasty and those supporting the Hanoverian succession, with Scots fighting on both sides. The battlefield is preserved by the National Trust for Scotland, with paths leading across the moor and markers indicating where different regiments stood. The visitor centre displays weapons, uniforms, and personal effects while explaining the battle and its aftermath, including the Highland clearances that followed as the government suppressed clan culture. Culloden represents the end of the clan system and the beginning of the Highlands' transformation from a distinct society into a romanticized landscape emptied of people. Jacobite steam train, Glenfinnan Viaduct. The steam train runs from Fort William to Mallaig during summer months. And following the West Highland Line through spectacular scenery, including the crossing of the Glenfinnan Viaduct that appeared in the Harry Potter films. The train is marketed as the Jacobite, though the connection to the 1745 Rising is purely commercial, with the route following a railway built in the 1890s to connect the fishing port of Mallaig to the Central Belt. The journey takes 2 hours each way, with a stop in Mallaig, allowing time for lunch before the return. With the appeal being the scenery and the nostalgia of steam travel rather than practical transportation. The train is expensive compared to regular rail services, with the pricing reflecting the tourist market rather than being affordable for locals. The Jacobite represents Scottish tourism, taking genuine landscapes and adding commercial heritage to create experiences that satisfy expectations shaped by films and marketing. The railway viaduct crosses the River Finnan on 21 arches, with the structure being built between 1897 and 1901 using mass concrete in a design by engineer Robert McAlpine. The viaduct is curved, creating a graceful structure that appears elegant despite being industrial infrastructure designed for functionality rather than aesthetics. The viaduct became famous internationally after appearing in the Harry Potter films, with thousands of visitors now arriving to photograph the Jacobite steam train crossing the viaduct, despite the location being remote and the parking being inadequate for the crowds. The viewpoint requires a short hike from the road, with the path being steep and muddy, but the view being worth the effort when the train crosses and the steam creates the image that appears on tourism posters. The viaduct represents Victorian engineering, repurposed as tourist attraction. And with the structure built for economic development, becoming valuable for the images it provides. Scotland is 5.5 million people living in a country that has never quite decided whether it wants independence or union. With opinion polls fluctuating and constitutional arguments continuing while daily life proceeds regardless. The landscapes are spectacular, with mountains, lochs and coastlines that justify every tourism brochure and Instagram post. The culture is genuine, with whiskey, bagpipes, and kilts being authentic traditions rather than invented heritage despite being commercialized. Yet Scotland is also declining rural populations, deindustrialized cities, an economic dependence on London that nationalists resent, but unionists accept as practical reality. The history is complicated, with clans, clearances, and conflicts creating narratives that are contested and used selectively depending on political positions. Subscribe to Passport Unfolded for journeys through places where beauty and struggle coexist. 35 locations across Scotland, from Edinburgh to Shetland, from Ben Nevis to Fingal's Cave. All spectacular, all complicated, all genuinely Scottish.